What I'd like to do is very quickly set the scene and then turn it over to General Michael for his opening comments. So the next discussion, as Guy said, was going to focus on innovative and effective training for large-scale combat operations. And as our branch chief said a couple of times today, that aviation is being employed 83% all the time. My, how some things never change. And I don't foresee in the future that changing. So the topic of training is very important. And unlike our sister services, and many of us who worked in joint commands, unlike our sister services, who are platform-centric, and they man platforms, whether they're ships or planes, the Army doesn't do that as much. The Army trains soldiers and then equips those soldiers to be lethal. So that's why this topic is so important today. And here to talk about this is my esteemed colleagues to my right, very quickly as an introduction, as was already introduced, Brigadier General Steve Michael, who is at CACT. My mentor, and many of us in this room, the mentor, Mr. No Free Chicken himself. Hey sir, I didn't bring my rubber chicken that you gave me. Everybody knows General Retired J.D. Thurman. To his right, Brigadier General Ray Davis, Assistant Director of Aviation Safety, United States National Guards. Good to see you, Ray. Then to his right is Colonel Ken Cole, Deputy Commander of the branch, and good to see you, and thank you for being on the panel. And then also Colonel John Ferrell, Director of Simulations, of course, at Fort Rucker. And so, John, also thank you for this. With that said, I'd like to turn over to General Michael.
Sir, thank you, and you know, as was stated before, really thanks to AUSA, General Ham, General Swan, you know, really for pulling this together. And I do bring greetings from the Combined Arms Center and General Lundy. Now, my title is CACT. Anybody that knows me know that I hate acronyms, you know, because what I do say is acronyms inhibit our ability to communicate. You know, a good friend of mine would always say the biggest problem we have with communication is the illusion that it's occurred. So a lot of times we sit in meetings and we talk, but we throw acronyms around, and there's people in the meetings that have no clue as to what's being said. So, yeah, it is CACT, but it's Combined Arms Center Training. Phenomenal organization. Really, you know, primary mission is to enable the Army to train. And as you know, our current chief and the former chief would both reinforce. You know, in this Army of ours, we're doing one of two things. We're either training and preparing, or we're fighting and winning. The fighting and winning part, so we're not seeking war. This is not a thing we're seeking, because it'll come at a terrible price. But humans do choose war, and then if the nation chooses war, then we win. So CACT is focused on enabling the Army to train. So it's great to be here with all of you today to kind of talk you know, innovative and effective training for large-scale combat operations. What I'll try and do leading in for about 10 minutes or so is just talk about some things that I think it'll set the table to enable, you know, the right kind of questions, and then really will leverage, you know, the experts that are here on the panel. Now, I would say foundational to this discussion is our concepts and thinking of both the nature of war and the character of war. And then I'll talk a little bit about, you know, our current iteration of the character war, you know, multi-domain operations. But the way I like to view it, you know, the way a mathematician would think of multi-domain operations, and why I think it's both, you know, revolutionary and evolutionary. And how all of that, you know, the nature war, character war, and our current view, you know, as this changing character war that we're transitioning to, all of that will drive, you know, the way we think and the way we train going forward. Now, as we all know, the nature of war remains unchanged, all right? It's essentially a contest of wills, a human endeavor, atavistic, brutal, probably evil in its purest form. And we win by, you know, placing our foot on the enemy's neck and by compelling him. And we don't win just because we happen to be right, we think, but we win because we're better trained and better led, and because we've been there before, and how we've trained and how we've prepared. You know, the Training and Doctrine Command's motto is victory starts here, and really this is what training is all about. We win because of how we train and how we prepare, and this is really what the discussion is going to be here about. Now, the character of war is always changing, as far back as we can remember, all right, from the caveman, Cain and Abel, the spear, Roman phalanx, Ireland battle, Blitzkrieg, and now, this current iteration of, multi-domain operations. So always changing. Now, we, in the Army of the United States, the Joint Force, the Department of Defense in general, what we always want to do is to be on the leading edge of the changing character of war. It's always going to change, and we want the rest of the planet chasing us. And again, the marriage between, the military and industry is to keep, America on the leading edge of the changing character war. The time that we stop changing, stop embracing change, stop chasing it, is probably the time when we'll begin, to lose. Now, in its current iteration of, the character war, multi-domain operations, I do think it's both revolutionary and evolutionary. And I would say revolutionary in the sense that if we master it, it would represent, a great leap forward. And it's about enabling the Joint Force Commander to wield all domains. We talked, we've done some of this before, cross-domain fires, but multi-domain operations and the thinking and the concept is truly revolutionary. In times past, when we talked about converging and massing effects, it was really how do we synchronize fires using the joint air attack team. So we're really talking about something that's exponentially greater, synchronizing all domain fires, not just air, land, and sea. Now, here's how a mathematician would view it, and this is why I think it's revolutionary. So a mathematician would view multi-domain operations from the factorial, process. 5 factorial is 120. So what that means is 120 unique ways that those domains can be wielded or those domains can interact for some tactical or joint force commander to solve a problem, tactical, strategic. 6 domains, and some would say we're already at 6 domains. But with the advent of 6 domains, it's 720. 720 unique ways that those domains can interact to solve a problem. We get to 7 domains, 5,040. This is why multi-domain operations is revolutionary. So I do think that that we're talking about something that's a great leap forward. Now, I would say it's evolutionary, not as in this slow evolvement over time, but I think when we fully master it, that is our thinking, our doctrine, our technology, and our training aligns. I think it's almost like a new species, something that we haven't seen or done before. This is the direction we're heading in. We're not fully there. I mean, if you talk to General Lundy, he'll say, we have this concept. What we've done and what you typically do with a concept, we've already pulled a lot of it into our doctrine, but the bottom line is we're not yet, where we aspire to be in reference to where our technology is, our thinking, and then our training, as we say, the thing that'll help us, deliver victory. All right. So, as General Swan, mentioned, as we look at the alignment with our, national security strategy, national defense strategy, national military strategy, probably the best alignment we've seen probably in our lifetimes. It's reinforced that we're back in the era of great power competition and conflict. Bottom line is we never left it, but right now we're a little bit more self-aware as to what's truly existential. All right, and hunting men in sandals, as important as those are, and that was an immediate threat. But at the end of the day, that's not existential and does not. It's not something that will represent the end of days, for America. So the bottom line is focusing and making sure that even as we deal with these important threats, we do not lose our ability for large-scale combat operations against a near peer. Now, as we get ready for a fight against a near peer, the thing we have to understand is that we can be pitted against an enemy, depending on what you believe, made in the image of God, and likeness of God, just like us. The enemy has the ability to think, and he's no more looking to die for the cause than we are. So winning is not going to be guaranteed. All right, winning again is going to come to the ones that take it, the ones that are better trained, better led, better prepared. So again, why this is so important. You know, the Army G3, Lieutenant General Flynn, one of the things that he said here consistently is that the next revolution in training needs to be home station training. So how do we get to the point to where we enable brigades and divisions to be ready, to be certified at home? So when you show up at a combat training center, it's not for the next crawl, walk, and run, but it's actually you go to war against a thinking, breathing enemy, and then the combat training centers can actually push you the way an enemy would, when there's only one thing that'll matter, but winning. So how do we get to the point to where we revolutionize home station training to where it delivers that? And what we tell you is the direction the Army's moving in is, so with the advent of, the synthetic training environment, the marriage of live, virtual, and constructive. Now, we've always been able to move left to right. So you can take, a live entity, instrument it, and it can show up in the virtual and constructive environment. But moving right to left is something we've not yet been able to do. Take something live, take something from the virtual or constructive environment and have it interact with the live environment. And I will tell you this is the direction we're heading in. General Gervais, who was the former Deputy Commandant General at the Combined Arms Center for Training, myself, also wearing the hat as the as the lead for the cross-functional team for the synthetic training environment, which is now our singular focus. She's the one that was tasked with enabling the Army to get this to us quickly. So right now, FY21 is when we expect, to start seeing the first iterations of this. But giving us the ability to not just train and push formations in a constructive and virtual way, but do it where live, virtual, and constructive is near seamless. And there's a bunch of pilots and that we've been seeing and observing, and this has great potential for the Army in general, and we think great potential for how we train our aviators. So as we look at the live, virtual, and constructive, and a synthetic training environment, it'll operate off of one world terrain. It'll enable us to train on the exact terrain on which we'll fight. It'll be optimized for software-enabled updates, and will be networked to our reconfigurable virtual trainers, which is where we're heading to, and have the ability to fully replicate the operational environment. And then really for our aviators, we'll get to the point, and I know the aviation community is looking at embedded virtual trainers, so where the system trainer is actually going to be embedded in the platform, the way the Navy and the Air Force currently execute their system training. So what you'll have is the potential to have an embedded capability to be through the synthetic training environment, to be connected to the reconfigurable virtual trainers. And really what it does, it opens up the potential scenarios almost exponentially, the things you can do and train, both training crews, but then really training formations to fight and win. And as we know, what we can be asking of our aviation community in large-scale combat operations is not what we've been asking of them, as we were fighting the global war and terrorism, air weapons teams and things of that nature, where we were talking platoons and companies on the attack, going deep, really being the killing force. In the 25th, we refer to it as the killing machine. Aviation, fires, and intel. Finding and destroying the enemy. A decisive piece of how we're gonna fight and win. We think the synthetic training environment will give us the ability to train that. When I first came in this job and met with General Flynn, he says, "Hey, guess what? We ain't gonna be getting any more terrain. And like we can get a whole lot more money. So what we can have to do is, given what we have, how can we train and leverage a lot of these weapon systems that they will need, and that we're chasing after for multi-domain capability. A lot of it is going to come in the marriage of the live, virtual, and constructive. So the final piece I would say, so in the here and now, there are things that we're doing at our combat training centers that's also getting after the way we've got to innovate and the way we've got to challenge our aviation formations. All right, there's some key initiatives: the opposing forces integrated air defense system, direct injection jamming, and then tactical unmanned aircraft system swarms. We think all of those are going to provide the problem sets that'll challenge aviation formations to practice the tenets of multi-domain operations to solve tactical problems and to fight and win. And the bottom line is, we think the synthetic training environment will give us the ability to replicate the challenges of the operational environment anywhere at the or the combat training centers at home, but really anywhere else on the planet. And the final piece would be, I think, the other thing that we really got to do better as an Army is to partner with and consistently train with our joint partners, the Navy and Air Force especially, utilizing their training areas and the considerable infrastructure that they already have that replicate a lot of these challenges that we're now trying to replicate and portray. So I would say, as an Army, we're in a phenomenal space, and there's great potential ahead. All right, I probably said enough. Hopefully, didn't put too many people to sleep. So now I would say it's over to the panel and the experts. Sir, back to you.
Thank you, General. What I'd like to do now is to begin to collect your questions. As you're writing them down, I want to see if any of the panel members have a couple of thoughts they'd like to share before I kick off with the first question. Gentlemen, any comments?
First off, thanks for having this old soldier here. Training's been one of the things that I probably enjoyed more than anything. My experience being out of Fort Irwin, actually with General Swan, in the many rotations of learning about our Army and how it trains and how it fights. I would call our attention to the training doctrine. And we can't forget what we've learned. We've been there before, okay? Beware of people when they tell you you won't do something again. Case in point, 1990, 91, I was in an armored task force. I was told we would never, ever deploy armor because it was too bulky, and the next thing I know, Saddam's into Kuwait, and we're moving out with the 1st Cavalry Division, and we're out there moving to contact, doing what we had been taught to do. 10 years later, after we come back from that, from Desert Shield, Desert Storm, we were told, downsize the Army, you'll never do this stuff again. 10 years roughly later, I'm in the Combined Coalition Land Component as a C3, and we're attacking with 2 corps, the 5th U.S. Corps, the 1 MEF, and the 1st UK Division. That's large-scale combat operations. So beware when folks tell you that. So we've kind of been there before, and my message to everybody, don't forget what we've learned, okay? And I call our attention back to our training doctrine, which says, train as you're going to fight. I use MDO. My question to you, does everybody understand multi-domain operation? This manual right here. How many people's read it? Does our officers and non-commissioned officers and our soldiers understand it? And my point being, if they don't, then we start an MDO university. Because if your leaders are not trained, you're not going to pull off anything. And I make that point to you. Training is the commander drives the training plan, okay? In other words, you write the training objectives. And that's what I did as a division commander. I learned that from General Scott Wallace. Training is led by trained officers and non-commissioned officers. It's right out of our doctrine. Trained to standard. What are the tasks and conditions and standards associated with MDO? And I would submit to you we're lacking some things right now that we're going to have to work hard on for aviation to pull this off. Fort Rucker's done a good job with the aviation training strategy down there in CATS. I commend you on that, and I just think you got to continue to work that. Train using appropriate doctrine. And does everybody understand the doctrine? That is essential when you're training leaders. Training time must be protected. Okay, as you start thinking about FVL, how are you going to train formations that are combat ready? I go back to my experience with the Apache Training Brigade. I was in on the early stage of that for the first 10 battalions. It was single station unit fielding and training at Fort Hood, Texas. It was driven by General Max Thurman and General Crosby Saint. And they did the Army a favor because it was standardized, and that's what I believe we've got to get back to on large-scale combat operations. And it's resourced. You must train to sustain. And I think we got to talk a lot about sustainment for large-scale combat operation. That is a long pole in the tent. It caused us to stop when we attacked into Iraq to get our sustainment squared away. Train to maintain. Maintenance is essential, and we don't talk a lot about that. There's not going to be a lot of contractors, I don't think, in large-scale combat operation. Maybe there are, I don't know. And then it's got to be multi-echelon, combined arms, and joint. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, General Thurman. We have a couple of questions now from the audience. The first is to General Davis, and the second is to Colonel Cole.
Good afternoon. Before I get to the question, I just wanted to reiterate some of what was talked about this morning, General Francis and other senior leaders, about the current environment in Army aviation. And I can tell you it's a good time to be part of the team. I don't think the team has ever been more close, communicated so well, and been so transparent. And it's paying dividends. We're speaking with a common voice, and I think we're getting the answers that we're looking for, and the Army's headed in the right direction as a total force. And I'm going to do everything that I can, myself and my team, to see that it stays that way. The question is, where do you see Army National Guard aviation nesting into the overall Army aviation fight as we modernize? And do you anticipate some consideration in FLORA and FARA to incorporate DOMOPS capabilities, i.e. Bambi, bucket, hoist? Let's start with where we are in the overall fight. We are part of that 83% overall that's committed, and we, with the exception of one MDS or one airframe, we are actually exceeding the DoD policy as far as bog to dwell, and we're doing that because it's necessary to meet the gift map requirements. I don't see that changing. The appetite for aviation, it's insatiable in a lot of areas, and we're going to keep doing our part to support that. And the feedback I'm getting from the field is that's what they signed up for. That's what they want to do. We're going to continue to fight to resource them to ensure they're properly trained and equipped when they go down range. But when we're looking at large-scale combat operations and how we fit into that, we're going to have to get after that as well. And while we're continuing to support, at the current demand rate, we're going to have to identify formations that we set aside, that we identify that's going to be a part of that initial fielding. Those of you that were at Quad A last year heard General McConville state that the initial fielding, what he envisioned for FVL, it would be the 82nd, the 101st, Special Ops, and he said the National Guard. That rang true with a lot of folks. He reiterated that last weekend at the August conference. We're leaning into that. I had a conversation with General Rugen earlier today talking about how we set the conditions to ensure we're successful in that endeavor. We'll have some challenges along the way, and we're getting after those now. General Magnum's Holistic Army Aviation Task Force identified some of the challenges we have with how we station, and we're working to that end to how we decrease the dispersion of our current formations, where you'll find them spread from one coast to the other. There's no way those formations are ever going to come together and train at an effective level. So we're getting after that. There are a couple of key decisions that have to be completed, and then we're moving out. The staff work's already done. We're inclusive of the stakeholders, and we're ensuring that their voice is heard and they understand why we're going the direction that we're going. But being somewhat dispersed also has some advantages. The TRADOC pamphlet 525-3-1, General Thurman, I have my copy, and you can tell it's dog-eared. It states that multi-domain formations must have the ability to organize in conflict, with leaders and staffs capable of operating in accordance with intent. Small and dispersed cross-trained headquarters, by virtue of how we station, we operate like that routinely. But we also have to recognize we got to bring those formations together. And that gets to being innovative. And for an innovative side, we have to look at the synthetic training environment and how we address how we train right now. Our focus right now are on the maneuver elements in the division headquarters, our CTCs and our warfighter exercises. Aviation, as well as the other multifunctional and functional brigades, are a enabler to that effort. We need a synthetic environment that focuses on those as a primary training audience, so they get the sets and reps necessary. There's a direct correlation with how well a maneuver brigade performs at NTC with how well trained those supporting elements are. So with regards to the DOMOPS considerations, I like to use the example of the UH-60 Victor, and which part of that was on the Guard. We engaged early on the Victor because of lessons learned from previous aircraft fieldings, where the DOMOPS unique requirements were not addressed until after the aircraft was in production. Well, we did it differently with the Victor, but the Army listened. The PEO and the utility PM, they sat down with us and said, what do you need to have? And it wasn't every aircraft was going to be equipped this way, but a plan was in place and space was made available in the aircraft. And in some cases, the A-kits and the wiring, the cannon plugs are in place to ensure that the DOMOPS part of our mission set, we're capable when that aircraft rolls off the production line. As a side note, the 60 Mike, we just got the airworthiness release a couple weeks ago to hang an external hoist on the non-medevac aircraft. We want to avoid that in the future. But the team and being part of the enterprise, having a seat at the table, our plan is to ensure that those capabilities that are required for the domestic mission are also addressed. But I'd be remiss if I didn't say that our primary focus, and we're laser focused on preparedness for the warfight. And that readiness, and that's where the federal funding comes to focus, to train us for the warfight. It's not for DOMOPS, and we recognize that. So we want, as ready as we can get for the warfight equates to responsiveness for the governors and the states and the citizens that are paying that bill when they need it. Thank you.
Colonel Cole, I think you have a couple of questions to address.
They're stacking up.
You're stacking up.
So I'll just go with the one that's on top first. First of all, my name's Colonel Ken Cole. I'm the Deputy Commander at Fort Rucker for all of 3 weeks. I just left Brigade Command in Europe, as General Francis mentioned. So we can address either of those two things, but obviously my recent experience as a Brigade Commander, and look forward to discussing some training in Europe and kind of what we saw from our brigade. But the first question, the one on top here, is what explicit and current manifestations are there at Fort Rucker flight training of the current shift from the emphasis in the kind of the global war on terror to great power competition? And I think that's a really great question. And I will return us back to a combination of what General Francis said earlier, as well as what General Thurman just mentioned. And that is, you can see our programs of instruction beginning to change time now for not just aviator flight training, but for our air crew member and our maintainer training at every level. So with the focus on rigor from the Training and Doctrine Command, every single graduate of every course in Training and Doctrine Command is getting those basic reps and sets in the skills that they need in a large-scale combat operation. And that goes for everything from trauma care all the way up to land navigation without GPS. So I wanted to emphasize that I'm seeing that already as the deputy, but also as a just recent brigade commander. As a customer of the training base, the soldiers are coming out already familiar with the concepts of large-scale combat operations, and the doctrine is being embedded into the programs of instruction all across the board. And I'd like to emphasize really General Francis's approach, which is our lieutenants and warrant officers that are at the school today are our future, majors in 2028, and battalion commanders and senior battalion standardization instructor pilots in 2035. So we have a solemn duty to do it and to get it right, or as right as we can. So I'll stick with that one question unless you want me to go on to this. Go. Okay. Okay. So this next question is a little easier for me to answer, just based on my experience with the increasing operational demand for aviation support and the shift to MDO training while still supporting current operations. Do you foresee a shortfall in being able to support aviation, aircrew training and proficiency and ground force training? So that's question one on this card. The short answer is no, but I'll tell you why. I think that, and we're already seeing this shift happen, and this goes back to another thing General Thurman said. Commanders are absolutely responsible for the safety and training of their aircrew members and their soldiers. And from the day you arrive from the training base, you're going to start training in the cabs. As we've heard, the cabs are extremely highly committed, and that's, I think, gets to the heart of the question. Yes, highly committed. That's probably not going to change, but so the approach that we've had to use as leaders and commanders has been, training is now everything you do. So every flight pattern you do, every landing you do, every scenario that you take time to conduct and plan has to be training towards a goal, towards a standard. I think aviation actually does that well. Our standards are well articulated. They're in writing, and we know what they are. Every aircrew member has to get multiple iterations of each one of those standards multiple times to reach the next level of progression, and that's the short answer to that one. Second question on the card is, will this challenge be amplified as the FVL begins its transition and legacy aircraft begin to draw down? And then ideas on mitigation of the problem and the challenge. So that's a broader question that I think General Francis began to get after with the .mil-PF discussion earlier today. So I don't think we know all the challenges that are coming with FVL yet, but we have to continue to address them from an entire enterprise approach. And I think our leaders have done a great job of remaining synchronized on how we do that. So, and once again, it's going to be up to commanders in the field to not let those challenges be amplified too far to the point that we mortgage safety. And that's one of the things as kind of my closing piece here. One of the things I've been most impressed by is how leaders at all levels have been able to, even with a high op tempo, have been able to manage and mitigate risk and keep aircraft and air crews safe. And I'll be happy to address that in more detail later.
Thank you. Colonel Ferrell, could you address your question, please?
Good afternoon, Colonel John Ferrell. I'm Director of Simulations down at USACE. I've been there for a couple of years, so I've had the chance to observe a lot of the PME and the changes coming through the pipeline, including being an integral part of the .mil-PF assessment for FVL and future aviation doctrine and training strategy, et cetera. So I'm going to ask this question, and then I'm going to break that down into a few parts and address it the best I can. The question is, please describe the plan to support simulation in the future, considering the new FVL platforms and the complexities of the multi-domain operations. So I'm going to break that question down a little bit. So that's a lot of stuff to talk about. We have a ton of simulation out there today to meet training for Fight Tonight. One of the big challenges we have today that we're trying to overcome through the CFT as we look at the future of simulation, as well as working with the FVL, is the challenge of our complex platforms and the ability to replicate those platforms accurately in simulation. As many of you know, AVCAT has been chasing concurrency for several years, and we're a couple of years behind on each of the platforms. And by the time we get caught up, a new platform is dropped, or a new upgrade to an aircraft, then we have to go through that whole cycle again. AVCAT's going away. So we are looking really hard at this DCFT, and we are putting a very hard requirement of 90 days concurrency between our collective training platforms and our actual system platforms. So when you drop a new platform upgrade, the simulation follows suit. 90 days is still too late, in my opinion. I mean, if you want me to fight tonight, I needed training capability yesterday. But 90 days is still going to be very hard to meet, given the current constraints of our both contracting, data rights issues that we're working through, and other things. But DCFT it's one of their top priorities. General Murray has it on his desk as one of the priorities. And so we are working from the Aviation Center to ensure that that priority stays on the desk, and we're going to keep working with the DCFT to help solve that. So that's one of the challenges. You know, our ever-complex platforms, FVL included in the future, we need to have a parallel development effort for our training capabilities. So we're not pushing platforms out there that doesn't have a training segment already fielded to support it. Okay, so the other thing is the doctrine. So having observed pretty much on a weekly basis all of the PME that we support with simulations, the complex scenarios that we've been developing in conjunction with the changes in POIs that Colonel Cole talked about to get after LSCO and understanding the complex operating environment. Our simulations still do not replicate the complexity of MDO as it's described in the doctrine, although we're doing the best we can with the simulations we have. I got a really good team. They've studied MDO, they've studied the hybrid Russian doctrine, and they're trying to employ that as best they can in the scenarios, given the limited tools we have. Again, CFT, we are putting a lot of emphasis to them on how do we replicate the complexity of that environment to include highly sophisticated integrated air defense networks, cyber networks. How is the space domain going to impact the battlefield in the future? How do we replicate that in simulation? And CCFT is trying to get after that, and we're doing the best from the Aviation Center. As a matter of fact, the Aviation Center is the only COE that is active on a daily basis with this DCFT because it's that important to the branch that we get our training systems right. Let's see. Last thing I wanted to talk about is the how do we support simulation? Well, simulation is a tool, or a set of tools, so to speak. A tool is only as good as the person who wields it. As General Thurman said, you know, training is leaders' business. We've got to train our leaders on what tools are available, how to use those tools, and how to best employ those tools to achieve the training objectives that they have. They have to know how to assess their units. That's going to require some big data and artificial intelligence potentially. If we look at every aspect of human performance at the individual, team, and unit level, and how do we then take that data and develop training plans that help that commander achieve his training objectives so that unit is ready to fight. So we're looking at that really hard, but again, it comes down to understanding the training doctrine, employing that training doctrine, and using the tools you have available to you, whether you have those tools today or you're going to have those tools in a couple of years. You know, the concepts of how to plan and execute training, I don't want to say it's been lost. Thank God it hasn't been lost. But we've had 15 years of a very high op tempo where leaders are really just going from training event, training event, and training event. We forgot how to plan that training. We forgot how to assess ourselves. We forgot how to employ the training tools we have to get after the fight tomorrow tasks that we need to train on. We are very good at what we do, and every leader up and down the chain I've seen are highly intelligent, but we got to give them the tools necessary so we have consistent and effective results on the back end. Thanks.
That's it. Your last comment is an excellent segue actually into the next question on how do units show up for training. And for the answer, I'd like to go to General Michael.
Thanks, sir. To read the question, for nearly 2 decades, training was delivered to units much like a commodity. Commanders were customers. What is the Army doing to return training management responsibility back to commanders? Do commanders know how to develop, training programs? I mean, this absolutely, spot-on question. So, one of the things we say is most of what we're focused on right now is culture, vice climate. Culture being, how we habitually behave. And given the way we've been fighting, in the last, 18 plus years, as this question was written, this is exactly the way we were operating, taking the responsibility away from commanders. So this is one of the number one things we're doing. When I grew up as a young lieutenant and captain, I remember having, a hard copy of the, mission training plan. all the training evaluation and outlines, and I use that, and this is what drove, what we did. We made a decision sometime back to put all this stuff digital, but it's almost like the tree that, that in the forest it falls, does it make a sound or not? Well, based on, physics and other things, we think it does, but nobody's there to hear it. So even though this stuff exists digitally, a lot of lieutenants, a lot of captains have no idea how to access it. So I think part of what we got to do in the training and doctrine command, we're challenging, the proponents in the centers of excellence. How are you training, training management in your schools? Maybe we've got to touch the leaders. So, as John highlighted, leader development. This is probably the number one thing we've got to do. So the question is correct, and I think we're getting after it through leader development. We've got to get back to the point to where commanders own it, and then they're the ones that are driving training. And then the second part, is the ability to assess, and is where I really think, especially at the at the battalion and brigade level, where commanders make a difference, are the assessments. Much of what we train ought to be planned and executed at a very low level, and senior level commanders, at a tactical level, battalion and brigades ought to be focused on crucible-like assessments that confirm or deny whether or training is there or not. I've got a second question. It has two parts, and I'll address both parts. So currently, our combat training centers rotations seek aviation support during their cycles. And I love this part. Can we ensure the maneuver unit properly uses those assets? Absolutely. So great question. And part of it is, we've developed a bunch of bad habits. So, an infantry lieutenant and an infantry company commander thinks of aviation as an air weapons team that's reacting to troops in contact, to kill, a couple of folks on the far side. So part of what we're doing is re-educating ourselves. And I will tell you, this was happening at the combat training centers. This was happening at the warfighters. So folks understand, large-scale combat operations, that a lot of it is about attriting deep. So a lot of what we do in the targeting process is how do you use your capabilities to tread deep. So by the time you make contact with the enemy in the close formations, you've got the ability to maneuver and decisively defeat them. So by the way, when you're in contact, you ain't getting an air weapons team, and is why the king of battle, you need to be able to leverage artillery, so on and so forth. So we're retraining ourselves. So the individual asks the question, can we assure maneuver units properly use it? You can see that happening more and more because we're changing our culture and we're getting back to, what's going to be required, to fight the near peer. And then the second bit is how do we get to train at echelon as we fight the aviation cabs with BCTs. So I think, number one, once we start seeing a less of a demand signal, so brigade commander might look for aviation requirements to assist him in his deep fight, because brigades have got, deep piece, attriting something deep, maybe massing fires or multi-domain effects in a particular engagement area, but he's not looking for it to support, close-in maneuver. He's leveraging some of the other things that he has. And yes, maybe for air movements, yes, for air assaults, but I think across the board, we're changing our culture. When you talk culture, you're talking 3 to 5 years plus. Climate is easy. It changes at a drop of a hat, but our culture is going to take time. It is require, we've got to start with this and we've got to continue. So as we change, leadership, we've got to hold on to some of these things, or the culture, whatever it is going to rise back up and not remain the same. Okay.
Thank you. I got a question. I'd like to go to General Thurman and then one back to General Davis, please.
Okay, the question is, for the foreseeable future, we'll be modernizing and training to fight large-scale combat operations while actually continuing to conduct real-world COIN and stability operations. How should we train our leaders and our soldiers to effectively maintain both skill sets? Okay, a couple of thoughts on this. I was encouraged what Colonel Ferrell said down here about a common set of scenarios. So when you're talking full-scale or large-scale combat operations, what comes to mind is I would start by developing full spectrum scenarios in a live, virtual, and constructive environment. You're off to a great start with that, with this synthetic training, because to do large-scale combat operations, that's got to be part of home station training. And part of this, the answer to this question is having a solid training management process. We used to do training contracts, we did training briefings, and you got to put teeth in that. For aviation formations and battalion task force, armor, artillery, engineer formations, there has to be a common set of standard operating procedures. That's what we did with the Apache program. Everybody had one SOP. That's the way we trained in the Armored Cavalry regiments back in the old days. But everybody knew what was expected. So for training management to maintain both sets of these skills, you got to allocate time as a commander and lay this out with well thought out training objectives. As an example, as a division commander, I was told to transform the division to deploy it back to Iraq, to go to Baghdad, form a new brigade, modernize the aviation brigade, bring in new platforms, and take it back to combat. Oh, by the way, you're going to do that in 12, 13 months. So what we had to do was lay out a Gait training strategy that said, these are the tasks that I have to get to be proficient. Every one of you commanders will be proficient in that. That's got to translate all the way down to the lowest level. Squad, platoon, company, troop, battery. In this case for aviation, for every rotation to the CTC, I was present. I was present out with every battalion task force. And I said, you're going to be able to move to contact, you're going to be able to conduct a hasty attack and a hasty defense, and oh, by the way, you got to sustain that formation. And we'll do the coin stuff also. So you can lay that out. I think that's where we're at today. Army aviation has to be fully integrated as part of combined arms, and it has to be practiced. It starts at home station, and that's got to be a holistic plan that's got to be laid out. But time is the number one thing. The number one thing you have to do is eliminate training distractors. You got to tell folks, this is what's important. The rest of the stuff we're not doing. And you got to get agreement from your bosses. So I think you're at a good point as you're talking about large-scale combat operations where folks have to be schooled and understand overall training management. I'm not sure we know that. Maybe we do. You know, I'm a little bit removed now. But that's what I would submit to you. So thanks.
Okay, this question is, what is the process for an adjutant general or National Guard unit to gain approval and funding for capabilities unique to its state or Title 32 missions? I can briefly cover that. The primary vehicle is the National Guard Readiness Enhancement Account, or NAGREA is what we call it. It's a year-to-year appropriation. You only have 3 years to execute the funding for whatever you're purchasing. It's both an Air and an Army appropriation. It's managed through the Army Guard G8 for the Army side. States submit a packet, detailing the capability they desire and what it's going to do. It's most helpful when more than one state has that need. Speaking for aviation, we do not buy a single thing from National Guard Bureau that a state hasn't asked for, and usually it's more than one state. We're not going to push a bunch of stuff out there that units don't need. Once that packet is submitted, it goes through legal review, and then there's a board process. It's not surprising there are more requests than funding, but we have been successful in buying external hoist, civil band radios, FLIR systems, 12-point ICS, and auxiliary tanks for our aircraft that they they supplement the domestic mission, but can also complement our warfight capability.
Thank you.
Sir.
You're going to comment? Okay. And Colonel Ferrell, I think you have the next question.
Okay, next question is simulations are heavily relied upon across the services. potentially overemphasized. How do we balance simulation with physical repetition and sets in the field to ensure the Joint Force Commander has a ready force to win? Hashtag winning matters. Okay, so that's a good question. And simulations, again, like I said before, are a tool. And how you employ that tool to meet specific training objectives is that's where the art of training comes in. There's a lot of science to it on getting simulations right. But as a famous economist said back in the 70s, all models are wrong, some are useful. Well, in Army simulation community, we say all simulations are wrong, but most are useful. So given that, we got to understand the limits of the training tools that we have. Don't waste time in a simulation that's not designed to train the task you're trying to get at. Use the simulation to get the sets and reps on specific tasks that you can do in the simulation, and then translate that to other training capabilities in the field or whatever to get after a broader training goal that you may have for your unit. That being said, simulations do get better and better every year. The fidelity, i.e. the how it replicates the real world, is getting better and better. Resolution obviously is getting better in terms of the visual field for virtual systems, but again, they're always limited. As a commander, as a trainer in the field, you got to understand those limitations, and you got to employ the tools within that limitation. Now, being overemphasized, again, that just has to do with the fact that you got to be able to use the simulation for two things. One, sets and reps on basic tasks. To avoid spending the time in the air that you can get in the simulation. And two, being able to simulate environmental conditions that you can't do live. Being able to shoot long-range missiles, go fast for 250 miles at low level. Take on some of the risk in the simulation to train tasks before you put them in a live aircraft for more dangerous tasks and maneuvers. Certain emergency procedures have to be done in simulation because they shouldn't be done live. So there's a lot of things that simulations are useful for. Just make sure you're using them for the right thing. I mean, and the balance, every system, the Black Hawk, the Apache, the 47, our collective trainers and our staff training systems, they all have their limitations, and they're all different. So each formation at every echelon has to understand what the limits are to the tools they have available to them. That's it.
Just to add to that particular one, so when I was a deputy commander at 25th ID and going through Division Warfighter, and I would tell you that there's no way to push and stress a division other than it's not like you can actually put an entire division in the field and push it at the kind of problems it will have to wrestle with and solve. So the ability to use a constructive and a virtual environment, those are ways to get a training at echelon. Training staffs, not just formations that might be able to execute a tactical task, but the staffs that got to be able to plan, think, at the speed of war and come up with executable plans. But the caution there is always good. Is that at the end of the day, so the caution there is good in the sense that we've always got to be guarded. That we got to remember how humans learn. Remember the nature of war, that is pretty atavistic and brutal, and it's gonna be messy. So we can't think that some kind of simulated event might be it, but we gotta leverage the technology. And then for example on the aviation side, the ability to train and maneuver large formations. There's not a bunch of terrain, a bunch of posts where you can do that, but you can do that in a simulated environment and be challenged. And as John mentioned. There's some risks that you can assume in reference to the challenges you present the team in simulation that you might not do in real life, when a mistake might be, catastrophic or fatal. So we got to leverage it. But the question itself, I think there's a good caution there. Make sure you've got the balance.
General Michael, can you go ahead and keep the mic, open mic here, answer the question that came from the floor, and then we'll go to Colonel Cole, please.
So not a good question. It was mentioned that the next training revolution will be the home station training. How do you see the role of the combat training centers changing to accommodate this? Excellent question. So really, what you'd find, so on the Combined Arms Center for Training, the Mission Command Training Program is under me, all the brigades, command post exercises, division and corps warfighters, and then we resource the, opposing forces at the combat training centers. What you'd find, in the Mission Command Training Program and at combat training centers, they will tell you, hey, depending on which brigade shows up, we've got different templates. Sometimes we got to help them, walk a bit before they can run, help them maybe do a little bit of crawling before they can run. So the CTC is really, it's like an extension of the division training. We really want to get to and how the combat training centers will adjust. It needs to be, the way it was, I think, in the early days when you go into a combat training center, you go to war. And you got a thinking, breathing enemy, and his job is to win, to sleep, step on you, and your job is to win. So we have to get to the point to where our home station training delivers brigades and divisions, ready. So when a brigade shows up in a warfighter, our division shows up in a warfighter, it's going to war, and it's not, all right, hey, let's work some more staff training, let's help you work in this piece. So I think there's a direction we're heading in. How do we leverage a synthetic training environment and other things to where credible home station training certifies formations for war, and then we add on it by pushing them through a crucible event at a combat training center or in the mission command training program. Because again, short of war, when we're going against a thinking, breathing enemy, at that point, you can't back up, you can't reset. There's only one outcome that's acceptable. So I would say that's how you would see things changing in the combat training centers. More you show up and you go into war, and less about, this is your final leg of training.
Can I add a couple of things to that? Folks used to tell John Swan and I out at NTC, hey, we wrote a great SOP, but the ink would come off in your hands. It's still wet, okay? Now, here's my point. You can't go to a combat training center trying to figure out how you want to train. We've got an excellent training environment right now. Given what y'all are doing with STE and the fact that you're connected to, I'm going to use Fort Irwin because I'm familiar with that place, is you got China Lake, you got 29 Palms with the U.S. Marine Corps out there and Nellis Air Force Base. That is and Indian Springs over there. You got a great venue to train for large-scale combat ops. And I think you've got to leverage that. When you look at the Army training budget, I was Director of Army Training. Army training gets no more than 12 to 13% of the training budget. At least that was my experience. I don't know if that's changed today. Maybe it has. But you have to argue for training and training resources because it is about money over in that building over. And that's something that you've got to lay this out because large-scale combat operation flows freely, off our mouth. It is very hard to do and be proficient. So that's one of the things I would encourage y'all to do on that.
And on that note, sir, I think this next question actually will address, or at least begin to address some of those answers. So to conduct large-scale combat operations in a highly contested environment, Army Aviation will be part of the cross-domain maneuver force that will converge to attack specific vulnerabilities of an enemy's multi-layered, mutually reinforcing systems and forces. This means building tactical formations and leaders that can think through and access and or employ capabilities that reside across the joint force. What and how do you think we should train our aviation leaders to be able to accomplish this? So it's a detailed and really fantastic question. And I think commanders at all levels are struggling with the answer to get those leaders trained to address this future problem. And General Michael, I think, hit this in detail with the CTCs and home station training. And I'd like to reemphasize training for aviation from the crew members to the mechanics to the drivers to the pilots is also happening not just at home station, not just at the CTCs, but at every other thing en route or in between. And that's got to be deliberately planned because the sets and repetitions have got to be addressed. Time has to be protected. Resources have to be protected in order to do it and do it safely. So just one practical example, a good war story. During this past summer, we had the great privilege of participating in really an entire series of Black Sea and Balkan region exercises, mostly called Sabre Guardian 2019, but also under some other names like Swift Response. And what we had the opportunity to do was take leaders, and we would drive and fly the entire brigade all the way across Europe, from as far as northwestern Germany all the way to the west coast of the Black Sea in eastern Romania. That's more than 1,000 miles through 4, 5, or 6 countries, both air and ground, to train our aviation and really maneuver leaders. And so the takeaway there, though, is you can't just do that tonight. You have to train to get there, and you have to build those blocks. And so the emphasis of fundamentals and protecting the training to build to that is incredibly important. So from individual training, during one quarter, to squad and platoon training, the next quarter to company level training, and externally evaluated training to battalion level training in those types of exercises are incredibly important. The final thing with respect to leadership, I'll just emphasize everything that little story I just kind of laid out, reemphasize the importance of leaders who are adaptable, who are flexible, and who have pretty extraordinary mental fortitude. And I think that's the answer. It's leadership, and that's why I believe that our forces will win in a peer or near peer competition, because we have the best. What General Michael's words were: "We will win because we're better trained and better led." I think we've got the best soldiers and the best trainers out there. So that's I think that my answer to that question.
Can I add to that?
Yes.
With regards to convergence, the rapid and continuous integration of capabilities in all domains, I see that rapid part as being our biggest challenge, because you got to get those sets and reps in order to build that proficiency. But right now, our biggest weakness is how rapid we can do that. And it also includes our allies and our joint force, those other key players that we got to incorporate them into that overall plan and the training plans and that process.
Thanks. We just have a couple of minutes left, and I'd like to ask Colonel Ferrell to answer a specific simulation question.
Okay, I'll try to be quick so we can get to some closing comments. But the question is, there is an OTA requirement coming out for Aviation Virtual Training Suite prototype. So there's several sub-questions. I can answer this very quickly. What organization is sponsoring this? It's DCFT, and the prototype is actually called the RVCTA, Reconfigurable Virtual Collective Trainer for air. We're looking at modeling a collective training device that mirrors the same way the ground are going to employ their devices, so training doctrine for both devices should be fairly straightforward. The idea is to get away from the AVCAT and a trailer-mounted system and have more modular approach with boxes that would go in a Connex or whatever, and have up to 10 cockpits per fielding site, as opposed to the 6 we have now. So it's going to be all modern technology. Everything's evolved over the last 20 years since AVCAT first came out, and we're hoping to get this updated with the latest and greatest simulation technology to support mixed reality. So I'll talk about that in a second. So the funding's coming out of DCFT through an OTA. It's one of 3 OTAs that were just awarded, one for the Common Synthetic Environment, which is the game engine that's going to be common across all collective and virtual trainers and all simulations and simulators, and eventually our warfighter type simulations and all that are going to fall under this one collective gaming environment. The other OTA was for One World Terrain, and then the third one was for the RVCT. says when the release date. We're looking at IOC for this in FY21. So it's a very short string. The technologies here, the integration is going to be the challenge, and the integration of OFP aircraft software into that environment and make it compatible. As I stated earlier, it's been a challenge for AVCAT for the last 15 years. We've been chasing concurrency. We're hoping to solve it through this. Okay, and last is what form factor is desired. Basically, we're looking at a reconfigurable cockpit. The seat will be just a standard seat, pops up out of a box. Everything's going to be mixed reality. In other words, I'm going to have a lot of a lot of things virtualized in that cockpit, but anything in a collective training environment that I need to manipulate, i.e. My TDAC, my cyclic, my collective, and all the mission function buttons on those we want those to be tactilely accurate. So it's going to be a high fidelity in terms of sticks, grips, and the control systems, so I can execute blind cockpit drills, so I can operate as a unit effectively and quickly, and I'm not searching with virtual hands. We started going that direction. That's just not going to work. Technology ain't there yet. So we're looking at tactile sticks, grips, and TDAC and stuff, and everything else will be virtualized. That's kind of the way we're going right now. We've got we've seen some prototypes. We kind of know what the winning vendor, what it's going to look like. When you get down to DOS, we'll be glad to show you that. That's all I got.
As we wrap it up, just a couple of thoughts that I have as a person who spent the majority of my time in the training environment. In fact, I was out there as Eagle 7 under General Thurman, and understood how we train lethal forces. And then I'd like to turn it over to General Michael to close this out. The first thing I would say, my thoughts are, we need to make sure we have trained and ready forces, soldiers that are lethal, and that lethality will come from proficiency at their mission essential tasks. It's basic blocking and tackling, in my view. For leaders and commanders, they must understand how to plan, how to resource, and how to execute the training. Because if you read history, battles are won or fought and won by units who fight and win, and they will only fight and win if they're trained. Just a few of my thoughts. Thank you, General Francis, for allowing me to be the moderator here, and also to AUSA, Guy and Pat and Sergeant Major. Always great to see you all and be part of this team. Turn it over to General Michael.
And I'll start off too with thanks, General Francis. Both myself, General Francis, had the privilege of being brigade commanders together in Fort Drum. Phenomenal time, General Swan, Sergeant Major, just the AUSA community. I think phenomenal event. And again, we could probably spend all day, all week, talking about training and how we can better train. And I think as you listen to the experts and you listen to the panel, I mean, the solutions are there. Number one, it's people based. It starts with our our leadership, and you heard the discussion this morning. And then, sir, to your point, so I sit on the training general officer steering committee, and we focus on what we call the training program evaluation group, the TTPEG, and I think you're right in reference to fighting for and for dollars, because again. This is the foundational piece. I mean, we can have all the best equipment, but at the end of the day, if we can't leverage it, execute it, and use it, we'll be struggling. And then I'll finish up with, as we think training, so whether we're designing training and we're designing equipment, it's always just juxtaposed with the nature war and the changing character war. Nature war will not change. So whatever we're doing, if it's not going to survive that harshness, then we're probably doing the wrong thing. If it's going to work in a nice, pristine environment, but when exposed, to silly uncertainty and harshness, and it starts to fall apart, we'll be struggling. And there's some key principles that apply. When we're training, we should always be training the brain, the ability to think. So whatever we're doing, if it's not challenging us how to think, it's probably not pushing us in the right direction. Train the way humans learn, experientially and by doing. Focus on teaching the principles and then how you apply them. Complexity, levels of stress, which is all about the operational environment. You got to replicate the operational environment we expect to be challenged with, and then we create formations that can prevail and win on any conditions. And really a privilege, to be a part of here. Here I took a bunch of notes. That means work I got to do, from my seat as Combined Arms Center training, and I learned, I think, more than I gave out. Thank you, and sir, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.